and welcome back to Book and Page. So we are at the final section of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and everything's finally coming together. We can actually make sense of what's happening now. Yay! So, as always, we'll do a brief summary of what happened in this section, and then get talking about things a little deeper. So, Green Knight ain't wasting any time. Gawain, get your head on that chopping block. It's time for me to do to you what you did to me last year. And Gawain recognizes this is it, so he pops down onto the chopping block. But unfortunately, he does see the swing of the axe the first time and flinches. So the Green Knight actually checks his blow and rebukes Gawain for being cowardly. Gawain says it ain't gonna happen again. And the second time, he doesn't flinch, but for whatever reason, the Green Knight checks his blow again, which makes Gawain angry because he wasn't cowardly that time, so just do it already. Third blow hits Gawain's neck, draws some blood, and Gawain jumps right up, ready to fight in case the Green Knight tries to do it again, because he promised to take one blow. If the Green Knight screwed up and didn't take his head off, that's the Green Knight's fault. But wait, it turns out that's what the Green Knight meant to do. The Green Knight and the Lord of the Castle are the same person. The first two blows get checked because Gawain kept his bargain in that little exchange game they played, but he kept the belt on the third night, so he gets a cut for it. Now Gawain's super embarrassed and humiliated, and he actually rips off the belt and throws it at the ground, and rants about how women are terrible. Thanks, Gawain. Not like the Lord just admitted that he set that entire thing up. But the Lord does forgive him, actually gives the belt back to Gawain as a token of their friendship, and we get a little more information. For example, we finally know the Green Knight / Lord of the Castle's name is Bertilac. Thanks for telling us now. And it also turns out that old woman that we kept seeing with the lady of the castle, that's Morgan Le Fay, who is Arthur's half-sister and thus Gawain's aunt. And also she set up that whole beheading game to try and scare Guinevere to death. Because nothing like a big green man getting his head chopped off and still surviving that says, cool, I'm just gonna die now. So, Bertilac and Gawain part ways as friends, in so much as you can, for Bertilac saying, hey, come visit, after having just, deeply, deeply wounded Gawain's pride in his own virtue, and Gawain has to travel all the way back to King Arthur's court just to tell the entire story. No, he is not proud of how any of this went. He's super deeply embarrassed, showing off the scar, and he's wearing the girdle as sort of this badge of dishonor. But it turns out Arthur's a lot more forgiving of Gawain's sins than Gawain himself is, and so he decides all his knights should wear this green badge, and it seems to become this weird mark of honor instead of dishonor. We'll talk a bit about that when we get there. And just like we started this entire thing with a discussion of kingdoms, we get a brief discussion of heroes of those kingdoms right at the end to bring us back into this cyclical nature of the world. And that is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Let's talk about some of these things. Now, this is one of those interesting sections that has some big topics to talk about, but also has some small things in sort of the words that are used, and just little moments that you can keep track of. And one of the bigger things of the small things, that still comes across as weird, is the reflections of Part 3, which was that big exchange game, if you remember, showing up in Part 4. So things like the Green Knight coming in and saying, well, let's get to it. I will give you back everything I owe you. I've got far too many pages dog-eared in this one. So, things like, may God protect you, you are indeed welcome, sir, to my place. And, yeah, that's again, reflective of the line the Lord used when welcoming Gawain into his castle. And then, like I said before, I'll return all to what you were owed. The whole motif of "you're not Gawain," which is the accusation the Green Knight uses when Gawain flinches the first blow, is also reflective. The lady uses "you're not Gawain" multiple times in her attempt to guilt seduce Gawain. Still not thinking that's the best way to do any of this relationship stuff. And then, really interestingly, with each of the blows, we get the same animalistic response that we were seeing in that exchange game. So the first blow, Gawain flinches because he's a deer. The second blow, Gawain doesn't flinch, but when the Green Knight stops anyways, he gets very angry and boorish and demands, "Why strike away, you fierce man? You waste time in threats. I think you have frightened yourself with your words." Which is like, probably not the thing to say to the dude that has the giant axe and is effectively able to chop your head off because you made an agreement. Like, just cool your jets, Gawain. And then the third blow is the fox hunting day. So the moment the blow hits, and it doesn't chop Gawain's entire head off, he like slips right out and is like, "I'm done, I'm good, we agreed. Which is technically not really, because we didn't agree on the number of blows. We agreed on the type. Because the Green Knight, way back at the beginning, said, "I will return the same blow that you give me," which Gawain then chopped his head off. So the blow isn't a blow to the neck, it should effectively be a beheading chop. But we established way back then that the wording isn't quite correct, right? And the entire deal is not acknowledged from the beginning because the Green Knight does not explain that he can reattach his head, which would have adjusted how Gawain hit him with an axe if he knew that was the truth. So Gawain's not above using loopholes here, just like the Green Knight was, because he can't reattach his head, but he can change the deal to the number of blows. And say, like, "Yeah, I hit you once, you hit me once, we're done." And the Green Knight lets him do this because getting to this point was never really the point. It turns out when you read that section about Morgan Le Fay setting up that beheading to try and scare Guinevere to death, that's actually the end of that entire mission. Is right there. This end game, which seems to be the end of that beheading game, actually more effectively becomes the end of the exchange game. And suddenly, that beheading at the beginning becomes an attachment of the exchange game, where they're exchanging blows. But the original point was for Bertilac to lose his head and then pick it up again in hopes that will kill Guinevere. None of this is aimed at killing Gawain. That's just a whole add-on, let's test him even more after this point. Which is really interesting because when, again, if you read the introduction or you know some of the motifs here, the beheading game and the exchanging game are supposed to be two different ones. And the author here has sort of just slipped them together. But he's done that in this really, I'd say, clever way, but you might also say just it's sort of tacked on at the end because we're just getting all this information at the end. Where it turns out, like I said, that first part is a completely different plan from everything else that happens, including the section we're seeing here. Because Guinevere isn't watching this, so we're not likely to frighten her to death at this point. That was purely the point of that first part, and then the testing of Gawain just sort of sprouted from there. It didn't matter who struck that first blow to the Green Knight. Just as long as somebody cut off his head and he could pick it up again, that was it. So we get this weird realization at the end that the two games are somehow one game, and both of them finish here. Because we thought we were finished with the exchange game when Gawain failed at the third night to bring everything back. Yet somehow this exchange of blows has come in, which Gawain never agreed to. He agreed to exchange one blow. He did not agree to the sort of terror of having 3 possible ones come out his head. So it's this weird thing where suddenly none of these games have the rules we thought they did. So we can understand Gawain just being like, and we're done. Peace. Nope. Nope. No more. No more. I want it written completely in writing, signed by a lawyer if we're going any further. Which is understandable, because he's sort of duped throughout this entire thing, because all of it is precisely theater. It turns out that whole seduction thing that he was, like, very against, that was all set up. So there's that issue with consent on both sides that time, because the lady of the castle was under orders from her lord, who has control over her. So she doesn't really have an option there. That doesn't, like, literally this tying up of ends makes that entire thing more uncomfortable for me than less so. Because it's this idea of theater, but it is precisely not that false, because Gawain is still an independent player here, so if it turns out he was less virtuous than everyone thought he was, the moment the lady went in and just like, hey, we should sleep together, if Gawain had been like, yes, that goes off the rails. Because the lady did mention a truth, which is Gawain is physically bigger than her and could force the issue. So if Gawain wasn't as virtuous, suddenly this theatrical performance that's happening has real-life consequences, and it does for Gawain as well. Like, everybody else in this situation, Bertilac, Arthur, the other Knights of the Round Table, they're all like, that was good fun, and Gawain's sitting here going, no, it wasn't. This was my life. In more ways than one. It's physically actually his life, but it's also his virtue. And everybody here has just thrown it out the window for a bit of fun. His own identity was challenged by a lot of people who then laughed it off. And Gawain can't laugh it off. He thought he was a more virtuous person, but fear of death proved to him that he wanted to survive, and he was willing to be a little less virtuous in order to do it. And everyone says that he did the right thing here. Even Bertilac says, I'll find it here, that he lacked, so is Gawain in all truth before other fair knights, as pearls are more valuable than the white peas. Only here you fell short a little, sir, and lacked fidelity, but that was not for fine craftsmanship, nor wooing either, but because you wanted to live, so I blame you the less. He didn't want that ring the lady tried to give him, he didn't want the lady herself, he wanted to live, so it's less blameworthy. Except Gawain is not seeing it that way. Because as far as he's concerned, it's not picking the lesser of two evils now. Because all of this was fake. He thought it was picking the lesser of two evils. But it turns out it was all a test. And so he picked an evil when he had the option not to. And that's what everyone's failing to realize. Or at least on the surface is trying to forgive here, that Gawain himself cannot forgive. And I say on the surface, that seems to be that idea. Because Bertilac has this entire thing of, I forgive you for it. And then he tries to actually play the part of the priest and forgive him fully. He uses, so you've so cleanly confessed yourself, admitted your fault, and done honest penance at the end of my blade. I declare you absolved of that offense and washed as clean as if you had never transgressed since the day you were born. Like, Bertilac tries to soften the blow. But Gawain recognizes that Bertilac cannot forgive him for that. Like, a human, especially this weird connection between the pagan and the religion, and the fact that we're in the devil's church right now, like, Gawain recognizes that Bertilac's forgiveness is not the ultimate forgiveness. He can't absolve him as if he had never transgressed. That's not his place. But Gawain is so upset with himself that at the very end, when he's back with Arthur, he actually makes the claim that it's taken root the stain that can never be lifted. Gawain is so upset by this that the idea of being absolved of this, even by God, doesn't seem possible. Like, this is a really deep hurt that Gawain's taken, that Bertilac tries to forgive, and Bertilac himself can forgive Gawain, but he can't force Gawain to forgive himself. And then we have this weird thing with Arthur. And I'm just going to read this section out loud. So it follows directly after Gawain saying that this is a stain that can never be lifted. The king consoles the knight, and the whole court laughs loudly about it. Again, from the beginning, you're just like, that's probably not the thing you want to be doing right now. And courteously agrees that the lords and ladies who belong to the table, each member of the brotherhood, should wear such a belt, a baldric of bright green crosswise on the body, similar to Sir Gawain's, and worn for his sake. And whoever afterwards, and that became part of the renowned round table, and whoever afterwards wore it is always honored, as it set down the most reputable books of romance. So in the time of Arthur, this adventure happened. So we have this sudden weird thing where Gawain is given the belt again by Baldric as a remembrance of this adventure and a token of that forgiveness. Gawain takes it as a badge of dishonor, and then Arthur somehow develops it into a badge of honor. And this can seem like Arthur, like the court, laughing everything off. But it might be a little different from that. Because the narrator, the author, gives us that little bit about wearing it for Gawain's sake. So if you really stop to think about it, this green belt doesn't have to be a badge of honor or dishonor. This green belt could be a recognition that all knights are humans and thus flawed. But we try to be honorable as much as we can. We'll make mistakes, and it's the recognition of making a mistake that leads to Gawain having this belt in the first place. But trying to do the right thing is precisely the point of the round table. But having then that badge on each of the knights and the ladies, it is specified that the lords and ladies who belong to the table will wear this belt. It becomes a personal reminder to each and every one of them that you can fail, but as long as you try and make things right, you're not going to just be pushed out because of that. One mistake is not going to ruin your life. We can build each other up and cover for each other's weaknesses as a brotherhood. So what's actually happened here that Arthur's recognized is that on going this adventure, Gawain has othered himself from the Round Table. And Arthur cannot take this belt away from Gawain to try and bring him back to the court. That's not how it works. Gawain has changed. And he's been hurt very deeply in his own identity. So rather than Gawain having to try and revert back to how he was, Arthur allows the court to change. None of these are perfect people. And Gawain, you're still part of this court despite your mistakes. We all make them. So, when you look at this, and you see that laughter, you think Gawain has remained external to the court. But there's a strong possibility that Arthur himself is trying to develop the court in response to what's been happening to his knights, so that those knights aren't being left alone. He's trying to make sure that they're always going to have a place to come home to. But there's a problem, which is what happens if some of those changes in attitude and ideals aren't what you want the court to accept. There is this lovely, lovely section where Gawain realizes he's been tricked. He didn't realize he had the option to just survive all of this unscathed without testing his virtue. So he has thrown off the belt. And the first words the knight uttered there were a curse upon cowardness and covetousness. You breed boorishness and vice that ruin virtue. Then he took hold of the knot and loosed the buckle, flung the belt violently towards the man. There it is, the false thing, may the devil take it. For fear of your blow taught me cowardness, to give away to covetousness, to be false by my nature, the generosity and fidelity of expected of knights. Now I am false and unworthy, and have always dreaded treachery and deceit, misfortune and grief befall both. So, in the beginning, Gawain recognizes his own fault here. And then he backpedals. Because he's processing it. And part of him realizes, again, he was put in this awful position against his will, without full knowledge of everything. Does he get mad at Bertilac, who fully admitted that he arranged his wife's wooing himself? No. When Gawain backpedals, okay. So, and may he who gives all honor soon send you reward, speaking of God to the Green Knight, and commend me to the gracious one, your lovely wife, both the one and the other of those honorable ladies, he's referring, of course, to the old hag, turns out to be Morgan Le Fay, who have so cleverly deluded their knight with their game. But it is no wonder if a fool acts insanely and is brought to grief through womanly wiles. For so was Adam beguiled by one here on earth, Solomon by several women, and Samson by another. Delilah was cause of his fate, And afterwards David was deluded by Bathsheba, and suffered much grief. Since these were ruined by their wiles, it would be a great gain to love women and not to trust them if man knew how. For those were the noblest of old, whom fortune favored above all others on earth, and who dwelt under the heaven. Beguiled were they all by women they thought kind. Since too I have been tricked, then I should pardon find. Go fuck yourself, Gawain. What we see directly there is Gawain forgiving Bertilac, but somehow not his wife, or Morgan Le Fay, who he doesn't know is Morgan Le Fay and set up that original beheading game yet. He's literally just blaming her because she's a woman. Bertilac admitted before this point that he set up his wife seducing Gawain, yet Gawain turns around and says, "Those women tricked me. It was their game that ruined me, and I should be forgiven just like all of these men of the Bible." Some of whom did really terrible things, and it wasn't the woman's fault. That whole Bathsheba thing certainly comes to mind. And this, again, is not a strange attitude to see at this point in time. The issue with it is certainly, again, from a modern frame of mind, more apparent. But when combined with that whole returning Gawain to the Round Table and changing the table to suit the changed knight, what happens then with this attitude being returned to the Round Table? Because prior to this point, we're supposed to have this idea again that we help women. But what happens when we might love them but never trust them? Gawain here actually gives us a hint of this distrust that begins building in the Round Table itself and Arthur's court, that will eventually result in the break between Arthur and Lancelot in regards to Guinevere. And we can't not acknowledge that Gawain is showing that break here. Heaven forbid we love somebody and not trust them. And not just somebody, specifically women. You should already distrust your wife, or your girlfriend, or your sister, or any combination of those, because they will lead you astray. And that is an attitude hinted at in many, many, many of the Arthurian tales. Mordred, as Arthur's nephew, is usually also his son, a child he had with a half-sister. Morgan Le Fay pops up often as an antagonistic figure, and Guinevere, throw Lancelot in there. In fact, many of the women are either helpless victims or this trick and trickery figure. But that is not the case for this story. Bertilac admits he set up that exchange game. Morgan set up the original beheading, but that is precisely not what Gawain is upset about. He's upset about losing that exchange game. and he blames the lady of the castle, and for some reason the old woman who he doesn't know is Morgan yet, just because they are women, despite the fact that Bertilac admitted he arranged it. The lady was effectively a tool in what Bertilac wanted to test in Gawain. But Gawain puts the blame on himself, but also on the lady, who, again, precisely is not to blame. She did not arrange any of this. She was doing as her husband told her to. But that's the attitude, then, that necessarily is returning to the court, and by Arthur having everyone wear this green belt as a badge of belonging and trying, that attitude's being accepted back into the court. And while it's harder to see because this is an independent text about one knight, most of the story, in all likelihood, is already known to the author. Lancelot was invented by Chrétien de Troyes, who is writing probably before this book was written. Mallory might have put it all together after this book, but he was writing something that people already knew. This author probably knew the full story, and he's providing a hint of the fault lines of the court right here, in Gawain's attitude that blaming the women is probably going to be the easier way out. If we could love them but not trust them, then none of this would happen. Which is not really how it works. Gawain should have known not to trust her, and he should have owned up and passed on the belt. But he didn't. It's not the lady's fault that her lord asked her to do what she had to do. And maybe that's the hints of it that the lady provides. How big knights can force the issue and do what they want. Maybe she is trying to point out the fact that she is a tool in this game. But Gawain still blames her. Just like we blame Guinevere, despite the fact that even if she truly loved Lancelot, she didn't love Arthur that way. How we expect a wife and a husband to love each other. It's an arranged marriage. She doesn't have an option. It's an arranged marriage between her husband, in some cases through Merlin, and usually Guinevere's father. Guinevere's not consulted. So how do we blame her in this love triangle when, I mean, honestly, if she could divorce Arthur and marry Lancelot, she probably would have. But women don't have that option in these stories. So we have to be careful not to fall into this idea, like Gawain, that it's easier to say, she made me do it, than admit something's wrong with ourselves. So, a very interesting attention to detail that this author seems to have when allowing the faults of the court to start showing up in the knights themselves. Okay, so, next set of videos, we are going to be doing some Shakespeare. Specifically, I'm aiming to do Richard III because some of the histories are often forgotten, and Richard III is definitely worth taking a look at. So, until then, I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.